The morning I spotted the moving truck at the end of my driveway in Aspen, Colorado, I almost dropped my coffee. I had been standing at the kitchen window of my mountain lodge, watching the sun come up over the peaks, thinking that this was exactly what I had earned after 38 years of working, saving, and waiting. The light was doing something beautiful on the snow-capped mountains, turning them from gray to gold, and I had my hands wrapped around my mug, and my heart was full in a way it hadn't been in years. Then I saw the truck, and behind it a familiar silver SUV I hadn't seen in 4 years. I knew whose car it was immediately. You don't forget the car your daughter-in-law drives when she once blocked you in your own garage with it. I set my mug down very carefully on the counter. My hands were steady. That surprised me, because my heart was not. Let me go back to the beginning because to understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what the 4 years before it looked like. My son, David, and I were never the kind of mother and son who needed to talk every day. He was independent, always had been. Even as a little boy, he'd pack his own backpack, make his own lunch, figure things out on his own. I raised him to be that way after his father passed when David was 11, and it was just the two of us in that little house in Denver. I worked double shifts at the hospital, and he learned to heat up pizza and do his own laundry and help me without being asked. I was proud of him for that. I am still proud of him for that, even now, even after everything. He met Sandra when he was 36. She was 32, recently divorced, with a sharp sense of humor and a way of walking into a room that made everyone look at her. I liked her at first. I want to be honest about that. I thought she was confident. I thought she was good for him. David had always been a little too easygoing, a little too willing to let things slide, and Sandra seemed like someone who would push him forward. I was right that she would push him. I was wrong about the direction. The first sign that something was shifting came at Thanksgiving, about 8 months after they got serious. I had cooked for 2 days: turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole, the sweet potato pie David had loved since he was small. Sandra walked in, looked at the table, and said she'd already eaten because she hadn't been sure dinner would be ready on time. Then she asked if there was anything gluten-free, because she'd recently decided gluten didn't agree with her. I smiled and said, "Of course," and heated up some of the roasted vegetables I'd made as a side dish and pretended that was fine. It kept going like that. Small things, the way she'd answer questions I directed at David, the way she'd reference plans they'd made without mentioning them to me until the last moment, the way she'd smile when she said things that weren't quite kind, so that if I reacted, I'd look like I was being too sensitive. Then, 14 months after they married, she told David that my involvement in their lives was unhealthy. Those were the words she used, according to what David told me in a very stiff, very rehearsed-sounding phone call on Tuesday evening. Unhealthy. She felt I was too present. She needed space. They both did. I asked David what that meant specifically. He said they needed some time. Some time turned into 4 years. I won't tell you I handled it gracefully the whole time because I didn't. The first year I called too often. I left voicemails David didn't return. I sent birthday cards that went unacknowledged. I drove past their house once, just once, and felt so ashamed of myself that I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes before driving home. I was grieving. That's the only word for it. Grieving my son while he was still alive and living 40 minutes away. Somewhere in the second year, I stopped. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I realized that reaching kept costing me something I was running low on: my dignity, my peace. I found a therapist. I joined a hiking club. I started yoga every morning. I started, very slowly, building a life that didn't have a David-shaped hole at the center of it. And then my sister, Ruth, passed. Ruth and I had been close in the way that only people who've shared a childhood can be. She never married, never had children. And when she died, she left me a sum of money that was more than I had expected, and more than I knew what to do with at first. After a few months of it sitting in an account while I grieved her in a different, quieter way than I had grieved my son, I decided to do something she would have approved of. I bought the Mountain Lodge. It was a 3-bedroom cabin-style house on a small private mountain in Aspen, Colorado. Not grand, not showy, but the back porch looked directly over the mountains, and there was a stone fireplace in the living room, and the kitchen had a window above the sink that framed the tree line like a painting. I paid for it outright. I told almost no one. My friend Carol knew because Carol helped me move boxes. My neighbor Helen back in Denver knew because I needed someone to forward my mail. I don't have social media. I never have. It seemed to me like a place where people went to perform their lives for an audience, and I had never been interested in that. I moved in on a Thursday in early October. By the following Monday, I had decided this was the best decision I had made in years. I drank my coffee on the back porch every morning. I read in the afternoons. I cooked meals. I actually wanted to eat. I slept deeply and without the low-level anxiety that had been my companion for so long. I had stopped noticing it until it was gone. I had been there for 3 weeks when I saw the silver SUV. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment and watched. The moving truck had stopped at the end of the driveway rather than pulling in, and I could see figures getting out of the car. David first, then Sandra, then someone else, a teenage girl I didn't recognize, who climbed out of the back seat and stood looking at the house, with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. I want to tell you that I panicked, but I didn't. Something had shifted in me over those 4 years, and it had shifted further in the quiet weeks in the mountains. And what I felt standing at that window was not panic. It was a kind of cold clarity. I knew exactly what this was. I had spoken to a property attorney 2 months before I moved in, not because I expected anything specific, but because I believe in being informed. She had explained to me very clearly what it meant to allow someone to establish residency in your home in the state of Colorado. She had explained the difference between a guest and a resident. She had told me what documentation would help me if things ever became complicated. I had kept that conversation in mind the way you keep a spare key, just in case. I went to the front door, and I opened it before they reached the porch. David stopped walking when he saw me standing there. He had aged in 4 years, a little heavier, a little more tired around the eyes. Sandra was behind him, and she was smiling, which told me everything I needed to know about who had planned this visit and what she expected to happen. The teenage girl hung back near the car, not meeting my eyes. "Mom," David said. "David," I said. "This is unexpected." "We should have called," he said, and I could hear in his voice that he knew this was wrong, that somewhere underneath whatever Sandra had constructed for him, he knew exactly how wrong this was. "You should have," I agreed. Sandra stepped forward. She had always moved like someone who expected to be given room. "We've been going through a really hard time," she said. "David's company had to downsize, and we had to let our lease go. And we just thought with all this space, we could help each other out." I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the moving truck, idling at the end of my driveway. "Who is the young woman by the car?" I asked. A flicker of something crossed Sandra's face. "That's my daughter," she said. "From my first marriage, Emma. She's 15. I hadn't known about Emma. In 4 years of complete silence, no one had told me that David had a stepdaughter, or that she existed, or that she was apparently going to be part of whatever plan was unfolding at the end of my driveway. "You didn't tell me David had a stepdaughter," I said, and I looked at my son when I said it. He looked at the ground. "We figured it would be easier to explain in person," Sandra said, still smiling. "I see," I said. "How long has the truck been rented?" "Just for today," she said. "We'd need to get you added to the—" She stopped herself, but not quite in time. "Added to what?" I said. She pivoted smoothly. "We thought we could talk about arrangements, how we could split things. You have 3 bedrooms, and you're here alone, and David is your son, and we thought Margaret," I said, and my voice was very quiet. "The truck doesn't come up the driveway." The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. "Margaret, let's not be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm being clear. This is my home. I bought it with my sister's inheritance. No one in this family knew where I was, which means someone did some searching to find me here, and I'd like to know how," David said, very quietly. I called Helen. Helen, my neighbor, who had known because she was forwarding my mail. I breathed through that. I filed it away. "I'd like the moving truck to go," I said, "and then I'd like the 3 of you to come inside, and I'll put on coffee, and we can actually talk like adults. But I need the truck to go first because I need you to understand from the start that what you're thinking of doing is not going to happen today." Sandra opened her mouth. "Sandra," I said, and something in my tone must have reached her because she closed it again. She took out her phone and made a call. A few minutes later, the truck pulled away from the end of my driveway and was gone. Emma was still standing by the car, and I caught her eye and nodded at her in what I hoped was a reassuring way. She was a teenager who had been brought along on this, and that was not her fault. The four of us sat in my living room. I had made coffee and put out some cookies, because whatever else was happening, there was a 5-year-old girl in my house who had probably not eaten well that morning. Emma took 3 cookies and curled her feet under her on the armchair and looked out at the mountains, and I thought, this child is the only person in this room who is exactly who she appears to be. Sandra talked first. She was good at talking. She talked about David's business situation. A company he'd built over 6 years had lost its main contract, and without it, the revenue had collapsed faster than he could restructure. She talked about the lease they'd surrendered when the money stopped. She talked about how hard it had been, how much stress they'd been under. I listened to all of it. I am not without compassion. What she described was genuinely hard, and I believed the financial difficulty was real, even if I didn't believe her solution was made in good faith. I understand you're in a difficult situation, I said when she finished. But I need to ask you something, Sandra, and I'd like an honest answer. If I had bought a smaller house, a 1-bedroom, would you be here right now? She said, of course, your family. That's not what I mean, I said. You didn't contact me for 4 years. You made it very clear that my involvement in David's life was not wanted. And now there is something here you need. And suddenly I'm family again. I need you to understand that I can see that. David said. Mom, I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I'm not saying this to hurt anyone. I'm saying it because I think if we're going to have any kind of relationship, it has to start with honesty. And I'd rather have that conversation now than pretend it isn't happening. Sandra was quiet for the first time since she'd arrived. I turned to David. I would like to help you, I said. You are my son. That has never changed. But help looks different than what came up the driveway this morning. If you need money to get an apartment while you rebuild, I can do that. If you need connections, I have some, and I'll make calls. But I am not having my home taken over. And I need you to be honest with yourself about what that moving truck was. David put his face in his hands. Not angry. Just tired. Exhausted in the way people get when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. Emma, from her armchair, said quietly, I told her it was a bad idea. I looked at her. She shrugged without looking up from the mountains. I told her we shouldn't just show up. She said it would be fine because you'd feel guilty. Sandra said, Emma. She asked me to be honest, Emma said, nodding toward me. There are moments in life that shift things. I have had a few. The morning my husband died, the day I brought David home from the hospital. This tiny person who seemed impossible and who became the whole center of my world. The phone call from Ruth's attorney, and now this. A 15-year-old girl I had never met sitting in my armchair eating my cookies and telling the truth because no one else in the room would. Thank you, Emma, I said. The conversation that followed that was different. Sandra, with the performance strategy stripped away, was quieter and more real than I had ever seen her. She did not apologize. Not exactly, not in words. But she sat differently. She stopped managing the room. For a little while, I could see what David might have fallen in love with someone, smart and capable, who had somewhere along the way decided the world required her to be calculating rather than simply honest. I don't know what happened to her before David. I don't know her whole story. I have learned to leave room for what I don't know. I told them the practical reality. The mountain lodge was mine, solely and legally. There was no arrangement that involved them living here, but what I could offer was this. I had a contact at a property management company in Denver that sometimes worked with people rebuilding after financial setbacks. I knew a small business attorney who had helped people restructure debt in situations like David's. I would make those calls, not for Sandra, for David, and for Emma, who had done nothing to end up in this position. David drove back to Denver that afternoon. Emma waved at me from the backseat window, and I waved back. Sandra did not look at me when she got in the car, and that was fine. We didn't owe each other a performance of warmth we hadn't earned yet. I stood in my driveway until the silver SUV disappeared around the bend in the road. Then I went inside and stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the mountains, which were doing the same thing they always did, entirely indifferent to the human drama that had just taken place on its slopes. I called the property attorney that evening, not because I expected legal trouble, but because I wanted to document the visit. She said I had handled it correctly. She said most people in my situation either shut the door entirely or let people walk through it, and that what I had done opening it, saying clearly what was and wasn't possible, and meaning it was harder and more valuable than either extreme. Over the weeks that followed, David called. Not the rehearsed, Sandra present phone calls of the early estrangement years. Real calls, sometimes long, sometimes just to tell me something ordinary that had happened. We were careful with each other. We were learning, both of us, who we were to one another now. That takes time. I wasn't in a hurry. Sandra sent a text message about 3 weeks after the visit. It said, "I know I owe you more than this, but I'm not sure I know how to give it yet. Working on it." I read it twice, then I wrote back, "I know. I'm not going anywhere." Emma sent me a photo a month later. A sunrise over some foothills near Denver. Just a small creek, really. Nothing like the mountains. But she had noticed it and thought of me. I put the photo on my refrigerator, and it is still there now, next to a small watercolor Ruth painted years ago of a shoreline I've never been able to identify. Some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I think about all the ways that day could have gone. If I had panicked, if I had guilted, if I had let the truck come up the driveway because he was my son, and love sometimes makes us abandon ourselves. I think about the version of me who might have done that, who would have spent the next year being managed in her own home, slowly hollowed out, and I feel sorry for her. And then I feel grateful that I had 4 years of loss to teach me what I was worth, and a sister who left me the means to have a place I could stand in and mean what I said. I did not get my son back by opening the door that morning. I got him back by standing in it. The mountains are covered in deep snow now. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way things do. I drink my coffee on the back porch, even in the cold, because I have learned not to trade the view for comfort. The snow is pale blue in the early morning. The tree line is bare. Everything is very quiet and very clear. I earned this quiet, every bit of it, and I am not letting it go again. If you found this story touching and inspiring, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next real-life story. Your support helps us share more narratives that uplift and empower.